Hello, I'm Dr. Matthew Potter, Curator of Limerick Museum. Welcome to part one of our two-part online symposium on Limerick in 1920. This is part of the Limerick City and County Council programme for the Decade of Centenaries, organised by Damien Brady and Tony Storn of the Limerick Library Service. 1920 was an important year in the War of Independence, both nationally and here in Limerick. The topics we look at today in part one of our symposium range from the murdered mayors to the Salesian nuns. I want to thank all our speakers, and I hope you enjoy part one of our online symposium.
Go.
The murder of the mayors of Limerick and Joseph O'Donoghue occurred on the 6th and 7th of March 1921. Joseph O'Donoghue was shot at Janesborough around 11:30 on the Sunday the 6th of March. Michael Callahan and George Clancy were shot around 1 o'clock on the following morning on the 7th of March 1921. The group that shot O'Donoghue were the same group that were involved in the shooting of O'Callaghan and Clancy. The link with O'Donoghue was that O'Donoghue was from Balnacargy, County Westmeath. He was managing the River Plate Meat Company in William Street. Now there's a unique link between Westmeath and Argentina because there was traditional emigration from Westmeath to Argentina, with the result that there was a lot of contact between the two areas. O'Donoghue, as I say, was managing the meat company's premises at William Street. British intelligence believed that not alone was O'Donoghue importing meat from the Argentine, but he was also importing arms and ammunition. This was the reason for his execution. O'Donoghue, as I say, was from Balnacargy. Sometime previously, the British intelligence had intercepted letters at his home in Balnacargy and had established where he was living in Limerick. On the night of the 6th of January, or 6th of March, O'Donoghue was staying at Mrs. Liddy's house in Janesborough. About 11:30, a knock came to the door and O'Donoghue was taken out of the house. Mrs. Liddy was warned not to leave her house until 6 o'clock the following morning. O'Donoghue was taken a few yards down the road and he was shot. Now, Mrs. Liddy knew that there were at least 3 men involved in the shooting because 3 men had come into the house. She wasn't sure if others had remained outside, but it does appear that they did. O'Donoghue was shot, was killed with 6 bullet wounds. Today, there is a plaque marking the spot where O'Donoghue was killed at O'Donoghue Avenue in Janesborough, just up from Janesborough Church. An hour and a half later, around 1 o'clock, there were simultaneous raids by British intelligence groups on O'Callaghan's house and Clancy's house on the North Strand. O'Callaghan lived at St Margaret's, which is on the left-hand side as you go across Sarsfield Bridge, whereas Clancy lived further down to the right at Castleview Gardens, which is actually closer to Toomey Bridge. O'Callaghan's and Clancy's had both been raided on many occasions by British forces. This had, I would say, an effect of desensitising both families to police raids. There was a number of raids in February 1921, and Mrs. O'Callaghan had a very clear memory of the raid being led by an officer named George Montague Nathan. Nathan never denied leading previous raids. On the night of the raid on the 7th of March, Mrs. O'Callaghan said that two men appeared at their door knocking and demanding admission. Both men were in disguise. They had goggles, motorcycle goggles, and they had their collars pulled up and caps. But it was very clear that she recognised the voice of the man demanding admission, and that man was George Montague Nathan. George Callaghan went down to the door and opened the door before he realised the danger he was in. Nathan and the man with him both stepped forward and shot O'Callaghan a number of times. Mrs. O'Callaghan rang for help. She rang Dr. James Roberts in Mallow Street. Now, Dr. Roberts took his life in his hands and agreed to come to Mrs. O'Callaghan's aid. He walked down from Mallow Street, down O'Connell Street, across down Sarsfield Street and across Sarsfield Bridge. As he was going down Sarsfield Street, he passed a group of 5 men walking on the other side of the street. They didn't challenge him or they didn't interfere with him, but they passed on. Dr. Roberts went on down to O'Callaghan's, but when he got there, he discovered there was very little he could do because O'Callaghan was already dead. Mrs. O'Callaghan had also rang William Street Barracks looking for assistance. Now, it is key what happened. She rang William Street Barracks. By their own admission, the inspector in charge, Inspector Ibbotson, admitted that he received a call at 1:20 However, it was 1:45 before he took out a patrol to go to O'Callaghan's. At the military court of inquiry, Ibbotson was never asked to explain why it took 25 minutes to respond to the call that he received at 1:20. Meanwhile, at Clancy's, 3 men passed down past the Strand Barracks. The sentry at the Strand Barracks admitted that he had 3 men passing. It was curfew, but he didn't challenge the 3 men. A few minutes later, he heard shots fired. The 3 men did more or less what the same as Nathan had done, knocked at Clancy's door. When Clancy appeared, they shot him dead. And then they ran back up the Strand, past the Strand Barracks. The sentry, Private Lewis, still did not challenge the 3 men, as I say, even though they were moving about at curfew. Ibbotson, in the meantime, had left William Street Barracks, and he took a patrol out to Clancy's. On the way, he called for Father Philip, who was one of the Franciscans, as the Franciscan friary was quite close to William Street Barracks and on the way to O'Callaghan's. He called for Father Philip and took him with him to O'Callaghan's. When Ibbotson got to O'Callaghan's, he then went from there to Clancy's. Now, he had no intimation. There was no reason why Ibbotson should have gone to Clancy's, but he did. He said he thought there might be something else happening that night. There was. Clancy had been shot at this stage, and it would appear that Ibbotson, who was staying in Cruise's hotel. Now, the death squad under Nathan, who passed Dr. Roberts on Sarsfield Street, were going to Cruise's hotel. Cruise's hotel had been taken over and used as a barracks for auxiliaries and British officers. The Ibbotson was staying in Cruise's hotel, as were a number of the auxiliaries. Now, particularly Nathan used to come and go. Sometimes he stayed in, if he was in Limerick, he would stay in Cruise's hotel. The Court of Inquiry, which was held on the 7th, Military Court of Inquiry, held into the shootings on the 7th of March, was more a case of what was not asked rather than what was said. For instance, Leslie Ibbotson, the District Inspector, was never questioned as to why it took him 25 minutes to take a patrol out of the barracks. Private Lewis, who was a sentry at the Strand Barracks, did not challenge the three men passing on their way to Clancy's, and he did not challenge them again when they ran past, back up the road, say, past the barracks the second time after the shootings. It's amazing that when shots were fired, that the sentry did not respond. The question would have to be asked, what did Lewis know? What did Ibbotson know? As I say, Ibbotson was staying in Cruise's hotel when he wasn't on duty. Private Lewis was a member of the Oxford and Buckinghamshire garrison in the Strand Barracks. As I say, he did not ask or he did not challenge the men running who passed the barracks going out and who passed the barracks coming back. The three men were buried in the Republican plot. They were the first interred in a special plot in Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery. Even though O'Donoghue was from County Westmeath, his family agreed that he should be buried in Limerick with the two murdered mayors. There was a massive funeral, massive cortege at the funeral. Now, there was a very instrumental or a very iconic photograph of the funeral coming towards Mount St. Lawrence's graveyard. And there are sentries standing on the wall, now IRA sentries, at intervals, standing on the wall, watching the passing cortege. As I say, the Court of Inquiry was to a large extent totally ineffectual. They found that the three men had been died from shock and hemorrhage from gunshots fired by persons unknown, and that those persons were guilty of willful murder. Now, the reason why one of the beliefs that was put out by the British, there had been conflict between the two battalions in Limerick, the two IRA battalions in Limerick, the 1st Battalion and the 2nd Battalion. O'Callaghan was not associated with the IRA in any case, but Clancy was involved with the 1st Battalion, and there was bad blood and conflict between the 1st Battalion and the 2nd Battalion, which resulted in the shooting dead of James Dalton in July 1920. The British intelligence tried to capitalise on that by pointing out that they didn't do the shootings, that it was one IRA group shot the other. However, in later years, Montague Nathan, who led the death squad, he admitted that he led the shooting, the squad that shot the 2 mayors in Limerick. He died, he was killed at the Battle of Brunete in Spain in 1937, and as I say, before he died, he admitted what happened in Limerick. In the Thomas, the writer who wrote the book on the Black and Tans, initially didn't believe the story that the Black and Tans or the British intelligence had shot the mayors in Limerick. But after further investigation, he was led to a retired British officer living in Chelsea, and that man admitted that he was with George Montague Nathan when they shot the 2 mayors. He admitted to being party to the shooting. Now, further evidence was that Nathan and this man, who remains nameless, turned up at Killaloe, at the auxiliary base at Killaloe at the Lakeside Hotel the following morning, and that they were very drunk, and they admitted that they had shot the 2 mayors.
Hello, my name is Dr. John O'Callaghan. I lecture in history in St Angela's College in Sligo, which is a college of National University of Ireland, Galway. Some of my research, my writing, my publishing focuses on Limerick in the decade 1912 to 23 or thereabouts. So if you want to follow up on anything in this brief presentation, you can look at some of that work. I should thank as well Limerick City and County Council, and in particular the curator of Limerick Museum, Matt Potter, for inviting me to participate in this symposium on Limerick in 1920. I want to tell the story of James Dalton, and earlier in 2020 marked the centenary of Dalton's death. Now, this is an extraordinary story for a variety of reasons. We have a deep knowledge of the revolutionary era, but we don't know it all, and this is a story about which certainly questions remain to be answered. It is the story, I think, of an individual's fall from grace, and the story as well perhaps of an innocent man. The bigger picture here is about IRA intelligence gathering during the War of Independence, and that system was highly functional, but the threshold of guilt and the criteria for punishment, they could be capricious. So instances of putative informing or spying could be shrouded in spite, perhaps. There could be ulterior motives at play, and those designations of spy or informer, sometimes they were no more than a label of convenience. Now, that was rare enough, but Dalton's case might fit into that kind of category. So he was born in Limerick in the early 1870s. In 1896 then he won an All-Ireland football championship with the Limerick Commercials team, and there's a photo of the Munster Championship winning team of the year, and Dalton features in that. He's in his prime, he's fit, he's strong, he's confident, he's charismatic. In 1915 then there's a photo of, there's a photo from 1915 of Dalton in full Irish volunteer uniform. And what's remarkable about this photo is that there are also in it, also appearing in it, are some individuals who later are closely involved in Dalton's killing. In 1918 he coached the Limerick senior hurlers to win the All-Ireland Championship, and again he features in a photo of that team. He's slightly aged, naturally enough, in that. He was also a decorated fighter and trainer on the local boxing scene. So in short, James Dalton was a Limerick sporting hero. He was tall, he was handsome, he was athletic. He very much looked the part, he cut a dashing figure. So to add to his stature, he was an intelligence officer in the Limerick City IRA. He was married to Annie Kelly. They had 11 children. 7 or 8 children would have been the average at the time, so it is a large family. They lived at Clare Street. He was a clerk, Dalton, in Limerick Corporation's electric powerhouse, which was at Frederick Street, now O'Curry Street. And on the 15th of May 1920, at about 6 o'clock, he was making his way home after work, about 50 yards from his home place, just outside a pub that was owned by his son-in-law, and in front of his 13-year-old daughter, Kitty. Dalton was shot dead at point-blank range by IRA gunmen. He was 48 years old at the time. His youngest child had just turned 2. So how did this end up happening? I want to quote to you from a letter that Dalton wrote to the Limerick Hurlers in 1918. So this is not about his eventual demise, but it gives us a sense of the man, his organisational skills, I suppose. It shows us a man very much in command of his position, and it's fascinating in itself. He might have been ahead of his time in some ways. Other parts of this would make contemporary or modern elite athletes, strength and conditioning coaches and so on, would make them blush or keel over maybe. It is desirable to prepare for the fray with a light dose of Epsom salts before breakfast. As the ground is likely to be heavy, constant practice of the muscles is necessary so that men will retain their hitting power to the end of the match. For this purpose, exercise with the hurley and hurling practice daily is essential. Do not stop too long at exercise at any time, or you will become mechanical and slow, thereby losing whip and spirited, swift movement. Don't mind the weather conditions, he says, because a cold can always be avoided by dressing in togs for exercise and rubbing over with towel and changing clothes immediately, putting your togs if necessary to dry for the next day. There is no healthier time to exercise than a wild, blustering day. Begin your work by hard walks every night and an odd short jog. Do not start sprinting until you feel that your system and sinews are toned up to work. When sprinting, start with a few loose runs at natural speed, so as to get the blood flowing naturally through the nervous system, and also to speed up your heart by degrees. By this system you strengthen the valvular system of the heart and do permanent good for yourself. Do not overdo exercise, it weakens the heart, and such exercise does more harm instead of good. Watch your weight, and if you are carrying too much, do not allow yourself to reduce quickly. The Wexford men are a strong team. So this letter was written to the Limerick Hurlers before the All-Ireland final of 1918, which was played in early 1919 actually, so Limerick versus Wexford. The Wexford men are a strong team. Your objective in training is to be strong, swift and enduring. To attain this, you must go early to bed and take full sleep, 9 hours. As you must be up about 7:30, it is necessary to go to sleep at 10:30 the night before. So he's spelling it out for them very clearly. Smoking is most injurious for many reasons to a man in training. Alcohol or fermented drinks of any kind are poison. Fluid should be limited. While good water is healthful in normal conditions, fluid compels a man to work harder in order to get fit. It is well during the course of training to take once or twice before breakfast as much Glauber salts as would pile on a shilling. Be sparing in the use of sugar, it induces thirst. You may use salt as it is valuable as a lubricant. Keep the skin clean in order to enable the pores to carry out their function. In the coming trial of our skill and grit, certain success is assumed, provided every man has the firmly fixed will to win and lays aside all other considerations for the next few weeks, but the steady determination to do his best. And the good news, of course, is that Limerick won that All-Ireland. So Dalton was a member of the Irish Volunteers, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, Sinn Féin, and the Republican youth organisation Ni Fianna. So I'll quote you here from what he had to say at a volunteer rally in West Limerick in September 1915, which is about a year into World War I, of course. "I don't give a damn who is listening." And it was RIC Special Branch detectives who were listening, and he knew that well. So, "I don't give a damn who is listening," he said. "I am prepared to take the consequences. We, the Irish volunteers, are meant to defend Ireland, but if we are asked to defend England, then to hell with England. And if we are asked to fight for Germany, to hell with Germany. Those who have volunteered or would volunteer to fight with England are only traitors, cowards and prostitutes," he said. So a colourful speaker, certainly. At a De Valera rally, a Name De Valera rally in Clare in 1917, then Dalton declared, "We must have a revolution, and this country will run red with blood." So those kind of comments were among the most extreme made by any Sinn Féiner from an election platform at the time. Dalton, clearly he never traded on diplomacy or discretion, even if one might think that they were required qualities for an effective intelligence operative. So I'll go on now to discuss his eventual demise, which was mired in half truths and hidden agendas. It was as mentor to an RIC boxing team, a police boxing team, that Dalton made the acquaintance of Detective James O'Mahony of William Street Barracks. O'Mahony had a network of informants in Limerick City, and they spied on leading rebels for him. So in the midst of an intelligence war in 1919-1920 that was becoming increasingly murky and brutal, and as the IRA were warning people not to have any dealings with the police, socialising with O'Mahony was very risky business for Dalton, and he came under intense scrutiny. And he found himself at the centre of an awful lot of speculation. And in revolutionary Ireland in 1919, 1920, 1921, gossip and rumour were sometimes in themselves potent enough to kill or be killed over. And the situation was exacerbated by a split in the local IRA. Dalton was a member of the 1st Battalion, and his 1st Battalion had a fractious relationship with the 2nd Battalion. They had fallen out at Easter 1916, or after Easter 1916, because nothing happened in Limerick at the time, and there were quarrels over what should have happened. The 2nd Battalion were not going to look too kindly on the fact that Dalton was a drinking companion of O'Mahony and a drinking companion of other members of the Crown Forces. And on the 14th of February then, 1920, 2 gunmen fired 4 revolver shots at Dalton near Howlett's Quay, which is close to Barrington's Hospital, again as he was making his way home. And the top of the middle finger of his right hand was blown off in that incident. So Dalton publicly condemned all of the talk about him, all of the conjecture about him, but the situation only got worse for him. It only deteriorated, and graffiti appeared on walls around the city. A bullet is waiting for Dalton the spy, and graffiti to that effect. There was a Dáil Éireann inquiry held into Dalton's situation on the 8th of May 1920. It was held above a shoe shop on O'Connell Street, and the finding of that inquiry was as follows. Let me read it to you. Dalton, quote, "had been guilty of a grave indiscretion, an error of judgment in acting as he had done," that is socialising with O'Mahony. "His conduct very naturally gave rise to suspicions. As against this, I was clearly of opinion that there had been no guilty or dishonest motive on his part, and that the suspicions in this regard were unfounded." So that is what the Dáil inquiry had to say about him, that he had acted inappropriately perhaps, but certainly he was not a spy or an informer. This didn't save him, and on the 15th of May then, a week later, as many as 6 men surrounded him as he made his way home. 9 or 10 bullets were fired. He was hit 6 times according to the post-mortem. It detailed 2 wounds in his chest, 1 in his right hand. 3 other wounds he suffered. It could well have been in his back, because Kitty, his daughter, who saw what happened, her account was that the 3 men she saw continued to fire after he fell to the ground. There was another bystander, a 6-year-old girl. She was hit in the calf. And at the inquest into the killing then later, the jury returned the verdict that, quote, "death was due to shock and hemorrhage caused by bullet wounds inflicted by some person or persons unknown." And Kitty Dalton, she claimed that she recognised the men that she saw shoot her father, but she took their identities to the grave. The official IRA position was that Dalton had been shot by members of the 2nd Battalion on the assumption that he was a spy. However, this IRA report said that Dalton, in the course of his duty as an intelligence operative, had actually contacted enemy agents, and he'd met with them fairly frequently, and he'd secured some very valuable information from them. Now, what information he apparently secured has never come to light. And granted, of course, espionage works, intelligence work, spying, if it was that, would naturally be as clandestine as possible, but particulars of any significance did often come out over time. Many War of Independence stories refer to daring escapes or to ambushes accomplished on the basis of good intelligence. No one else claims that Dalton was manipulating O'Mahony rather than vice versa, however. At the same time, there's no evidence that Dalton provided information to the police. So while we might not know exactly what was discussed, my suggestion, my perspective is that O'Mahony and his colleagues could have been playing on Dalton's apparent weakness for alcohol. So one IRA man said, talking about Dalton, he was very fond of liquor. This sergeant, talking about O'Mahony, this sergeant kept a bottle and he'd go into the sergeant's house. And another IRA veteran recalled that, talking about Dalton, he used to go an odd time to the Limerick RIC barracks for an after-hours drink in their canteen, as he was rather a thirsty soul. That undoubtedly was rash of him and naturally made him suspect. Now, the 2nd Battalion, I think it's reasonable to say, would not have killed Dalton if they believed he was doing IRA duty and gathering valuable information that would be useful to the IRA. But they wouldn't have killed him either, I think it's also reasonable to say, if there had not been such bad blood between the two factions, between the 1st and 2nd Battalion. So that rivalry, that tension is key to what happened. There was some compassion for Dalton in Limerick. There was a feeling that he wasn't a spy or an informer in any deliberate sense, but Republicans didn't want to publicly express sympathy for him because he had contravened clear rules. In July 1920 then, the Department of Home Affairs decided to make an ex-gratia, or a compassionate payment of €500 to Dalton's, £500, to Dalton's family. Part of the legacy of the killing is obvious in Dalton's military service pension file. In 1926, his widow, Annie, felt compelled to write to the Army Pensions Department. She wrote first in July of 26 and then again in that October. I am very badly in need of money at present, she said. Another line is that I am presently in very bad circumstances, depending on 2 children's earnings to maintain myself and 10 children. That was 1926. In 1927, 9 children were still living with Annie. They're now living at Lelia Street. A Garda sergeant described the Dalton situation to his superintendent in May 1927. Annie, he said, used to pledge clothes, etc. in pawns to meet the demands and needs of her house. She is in a bad way owing to her big family. And the Garda Commissioner's office was interested in the case and confirmed to the Army Finance Officer that the family are not in comfortable circumstances. So Annie then was subsequently paid an allowance for herself and her children under the Army Pensions Act. They received a payment in 1920, the family, and another in 1924, and that was actually recouped from the pension. Annie died of liver disease in 1933. She was 55 years old. Most of the children at that stage were of age and were no longer eligible for state support. If we bring the story on out to the 1960s, in 1966, Dan Breen, the famous Tipperary Republican IRA man, he petitioned the Minister for Defence, who was Michael Hilliard at the time, about clearing the name of Jim Dalton, as he called him. Breen said, Dalton was innocent and was shot in order to cover up others. It is a shame his name was never cleared and the right people named. Dalton was not a police agent. He was killed to cover up the crimes of some high-up people who were not all they professed to be. His name should now be cleared. It was agreed, Breen is talking now about Dalton's shooting. It was agreed, as it would not suit many people still about. So the killing was agreed, Breen said, to ensure that information which Dalton had about some leading Republicans did not get into the public domain. Hilliard, the minister, replied that the Department of Defence considered Dalton's name to have been cleared before his death. Dalton was now being awarded a service medal to show that he'd been an active Republican during the War of Independence, but Breen was not satisfied. What I am after, he wrote, is to pinpoint the names of men who got him murdered. I don't want to get the men that fire the shots. I want the people that got him murdered to cover up their deeds. There is some of them alive today. So Breen was alleging that the reason cited for Dalton's execution was a pretense. The implication of this, of course, is that the 1st, 2nd Battalion conflict was not the real issue at stake at all. That Dalton's killers were pawns of more senior figures. Now, what dangers Dalton posed or what he knew, Breen doesn't state. He doesn't specify. So this accusation, it remains in the realm of speculation. But it's an intriguing idea, this idea that Dalton knew too much about some shadowy senior Republicans. The day before Dalton was shot, so on the 19th of May 1920, the 2nd Battalion killed 2 RIC sergeants in Limerick City, and police reprisals were immediate. One civilian was shot dead, others suffered bullet wounds or they were beaten. Incendiary bombs were used against a bakery on William Street owned by the Daly family, and the Dalys were leading Republicans in Limerick also. When the fire brigade arrived to Daly's bakery, rifle volleys from the adjacent police barracks obstructed its work. The police were obviously the guilty party, firing on the fire brigade to prevent them putting out the fire in Daly's. But they were fully aware of the 1st, 2nd Battalion relations in Limerick, and the influence of the Dalys, the Daly family in particular, in undermining the 1st Battalion's reputation. So the police attributed the attack on the fire brigade to allies of Dalton. In the aftermath of Dalton's execution, or his killing, it wasn't a formal execution as such, and there's an important difference, of course. In the aftermath of Dalton's killing, Eamon Dorr, who was an intelligence officer in the 2nd Battalion and who was married to one of the Daly women, he received an awful lot of unwanted attention from Dalton's mother-in-law. She would call to his business every morning, and to quote now from Dorr's account, excuse me, kneeling on the footpath outside, she came into the shop on her knees, cursing me and my people-in-law, the Dalys. So Dalton's family very clearly at the time held the Dalys responsible. In June 1920, so in the month following Dalton's killing, the RIC County Inspector for Limerick, whose name was Marnan, he commented that friends of Dalton were, quote, endeavouring to have revenge on some of the leading Sinn Féin extremists who brought about his murder, end quote. And on the night of the 24th of June, there were shots fired at houses of members of the 2nd Battalion, IRA men in Limerick, and the police said that those shots were fired by allies of Dalton, and this was all part of the 1st, 2nd Battalion feud, and the feud that continued over the killing of Dalton. A curious footnote, I suppose, at this time is that on the 19th of July, the RIC detective, James O'Mahony, he suffered a costly property loss. So a police report gives us this detail. The furniture of Sergeant J.J. O'Mahony, which had been taken to the quay early that morning, was completely destroyed by fire. The furniture was consigned to J. Wilson, Liverpool, in order to conceal the identity of the owner. A claim for £1,600 has been lodged. So it looks like O'Mahony was preparing to depart Limerick and to follow what was, for the time, remarkably valuable furniture, if it was worth £1,600. So at face value, this has nothing to do with the Dalton case. It's just another intriguing part of the story for which we would require more information, I think, in context to fully understand it. So to try to sum up in some way, or to try to offer some conclusion, Dalton's killing was part of the dirty war that lurked just underneath the surface of the War of Independence. It underscores the brutality and the ruthlessness of the intelligence war in particular. So as I said earlier, the early intelligence gathering machine, the apparatus, it was very effective in Limerick and elsewhere, but the threshold of guilt and the criteria for punishment in cases like Dalton's, it could be capricious. Not everyone was equal before IRA justice, and it wasn't uncommon for instances of putative informing to be shrouded in perhaps personal spite. So Dalton's case, it's entangled in all of these complexities. There are degrees of guilt, of innocence too, perhaps. It seems very easy to judge Dalton guilty of poor judgment and bad practice, and he was guilty of those things, it seems. But was he guilty of spying or informing? Was he an innocent man? His killers were certainly less forgiving of him. That is really an introduction to the story of James Dalton. As I said, if you want to follow up on any of this, perhaps look at some of the work that is available on the time, and thanks again to Limerick Museum.
Hello, my name is Sharon Slater, and I'm a local historian with a primary focus on the social life of 19th and early 20th century Limerick City. Today we're going to look at the daily life in Limerick City from Halloween to Christmas 1920, through the articles and adverts of the Munster News, the Limerick Leader and the Limerick Chronicle. All three of these papers had slightly different audiences. The Munster News was aimed at farmers, the Limerick Chronicle was aimed at the established Protestant and business families of the city, and the Limerick Leader was aimed at Catholic and new businesses in the city. All three of the newspapers used their front pages for advertisements, with regular adverts throughout the period from the monster stores like Cannock's, McBurney's and Todd's. Unsurprisingly, during the season, their winter wear and furs were advertised often. There are also modern advertisements for motorcycles and motor cars in the Leader and the Chronicle. Motorcycles were on sale by Nestors of O'Connell Street, and motor cars, which were on hire from Richard Lunn of Wickham Street. The Munster News would highlight spit grit, a shell grit for chickens, and Corey tobacco powder to prevent scab in sheep. The back page of the Limerick Leader gives little indication of the trouble brewing in the country. Instead, the column, The Home Circle, gives useful hints and recipes, such as the importance of adding salt to your beef tea until the meat has been cooked for some time, as the salt acts upon the fibres and prevents it from giving out all its nourishing properties. This was the height of the War of Independence, which began in January 1919 and ended in July 1921, and the local papers took note of national events. The national news during this period started with the execution of Kevin Barry in Mountjoy Jail in November 1st. The Limerick Leader of that same day had the headline, "Extreme penalty, Kevin Barry executed. Brave boy's last moments." All three of the newspapers also wrote about Cork Mayor Terence McSweeney, who died on the 25th of October after a 74-day-long hunger strike while in prison. The papers reported on his death, his funeral, and the aftermath for his widow. One of the most shocking events of the period happened on the 21st of November, when 30 people were killed or fatally wounded in Croke Park, in what became known as Bloody Sunday. 2 days later, the Limerick Chronicle gave the headlines: "Stop Press News, the Croke Park shootings, military inquiries open. Sunday's tragedies in Dublin, an alarm in Dublin." There was an air of unrest, with curfews in common practice throughout the country, and a declaration of martial law on the 10th of December in counties Cork, Kerry, Limerick and Tipperary, followed by burning of Cork on the 11th of December. Emigration was extremely high during this time, and the Limerick Leader noted that during the month of November 1920, there were 1,694 emigrants from Ireland. Of these, 1,499 were going to the United States of America. In the same month a year earlier, there were only 319 emigrants reported. Meanwhile, local outrages in Limerick took the place of the national news and local press. The headline of the 1st of November tells of an outrage in Limerick which took place on Saturday, the 30th of October. On that night, Mrs. Daly, the mother of Ned Daly, who was executed for his role in the Easter 1916 rising, opened her door on the Ennis Road. There were two men standing there, and they said they had a message for one of her daughters. When her daughter, Miss Daly, came to the door, she was grabbed and her hair was cut off with a razor. They also cut her hand in the process. The paper reported that, and I quote, "Her screams were heard by the people living in the locality." Although the Limerick Leader does not mention her by name, the Daly family biographer Helen Nitton confirms that this attack was carried out on Agnes Daly. Another hair-cutting incident occurred in the city on the 10th of November and was reported in the Munster News. 6 armed, disguised men entered the house of Miss Christina Maher in Bohaboy and cut off her hair. The paper states that no reason was assigned for the act. Miss Maher's brother was arrested some time ago and released. This last line is a very important code, denoting that this was an act of reprisal against Republicans in the city. This was common practice, reprisals in the city. A bizarre attempted raid of the Augustinian Priory on O'Connell Street took place on November 10th. At about midnight, 2 armed men attempted to gain entry into the building. They broke a window, but were stopped by a shutter that was shut from the inside. The housekeeper was awoken by the noise and woke Father Hunt, who let the men in. The men proceeded to search the priory before leaving in, and I quote, "a courteous and orderly manner." 2 days later, a raid of the Sacred Heart House and College in the Crescent took place. Again, when one of the older, Father Potter, was disturbed, he gave the raiders keys so they could carry out a thorough search. Unlike the raid on the Augustinians, this time the perpetrators took away several war trophies, including a cartridge clip and helmet. It wasn't just religious buildings that were raided. On Monday, the 22nd of November, the Limerick County Council offices on O'Connell Street was raided. Earlier that day, the Town Hall in Rutland Street was raided. In both cases, the minute book and a large number of documents were taken. The military police were implicated in both of these raids and were involved in several other reported outrages. The Limerick Chronicle of November 20th tells of an event in Limerick with the headline, "Soldiers run amok, windows smashed in business premises." They describe how at 9 o'clock on Thursday night, a party of soldiers broke windows starting at Mrs. P. Burke's provision store on Denmark Street and continued in both directions, smashing windows on Patrick Street, Rutland Street, O'Connell Street, William Street and Rocha Street. The owners of several of the buildings injured during the attack were named. These were Mr. T.J. Wallace, who owned a furniture store on Rocha Street. The front window of John Quinn & Co. was completely demolished. A month earlier, Quinn had lost a quantity of jam, sugar and tea in a fire. 3 windows in Todd's, 2 windows in Lipton's, and 1 in William Kidd and a number of other stores were broken. What looked like a bullet hole was in T. Geary's confectionery and restaurant. The soldiers were stopped in Patrick Street by a military officer who ordered them back to the barracks. But an hour later, another party of military attacked the town hall in Rutland Street and shattered all the glass in the 6 windows on the ground floor. Again, this was in retaliation for the shooting dead of a soldier, Private Spackman, of the Yorkshire, Oxford and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, and wounding of Private Robbins in Cratloe. All 3 newspapers would carry reports of the trial in Dublin of James O'Neill and Patrick Blake, who were accused of shooting dead Constable Oakley of the Black and Tans in Henry Street in July. Both men were acquitted of the crime, and while returning from the trial on Saturday the 20th of November, they got a motor car from Limerick Junction heading to the city. They were stopped near Ula by a group of Black and Tans who shot O'Neill and mistakenly shot Blake's brother. Both men were killed. The following day, the Limerick Chronicle had the headlines: "Acquitted prisoner shot dead, brother of other prisoner killed." The paper also noted the funerals of the victims, which took place for both men from St. Michael's Church in Denmark Street to Mount St. Lawrence Cemetery. Other violent incidences in the city during this time included, on the 15th of November, when a bomb was thrown into the public house of P. Walsh on Bedford Row. 1 person was injured during the explosion, which caused a hole in the floor and shattered glass in the front door and sent shrapnel throughout the business. Luckily, the wife of P. Walsh was behind the counter at the time and was uninjured. Articles in the Limerick Chronicle on the 16th of November tell of a military dispatch rider who was attacked, his revolver removed when he was leaving a shop on Wolftoe Street. The attackers were unmasked but evaded custody. The leader of the 23rd of November tells of some prisoners were conveyed in motor lorries yesterday under prison escort to Limerick, and in the evening they were returning by way of Plunkett Street. Shots were fired, and these noises caused a horse in the thoroughfare to take fright and upset a car on which there were 2 or 3 men. The men were slightly injured. Another incident occurred on that same day on Lower Cecil Street about 7 o'clock. Some plainclothes policemen were in pursuit of a youth, seemed to be running away, and a shot was fired, but without injury. Subsequently, the youth, one John Larkin, was taken into custody and detained. The Munster News of the 24th of November tells how a city hotel was commandeered. Now, Cruise's Hotel on O'Connell Street had been commandeered by the military. It was presumed it would be used for the accommodation of officers attached to the garrison. Despite this, life had to continue for those living in the city, and the newspapers captured a glimpse of life in Limerick during this period. One of the issues in the city was the interruption of food supply, and on November 5th, the Limerick County Committee sent out an appeal through the Limerick leader to the farmers, asking them to grow more wheat. There was strife in the bacon factories, and a notice was placed in the Limerick Chronicle on the 13th of November, stating, "To farmers and pig feeders, in consequence of the labour troubles, we will be unable to purchase pigs until further notice." It was signed Henry Denny and Sons, J. Matterson's and Sons, W. J. Shaw and Sons, and O'Mara Limited. This notice was the result of an impending strike action by the Limerick pork butchers, who were demanding a £1 pay increase, but were offered 7 shillings and 6.5 pence instead. They refused the offer this time. Some of the regular livestock auctions were also impacted, with the Chronicle of the 20th of November reporting that Hartigan's cattle paddock on Mulgrave Street had 305 head of cattle on sale on the day before, which sold moderately as demand for heavy cattle was low owing to the transit difficulties. The small cattle sold well. At William Fitt's annual sale of bull calves, there were 52 bull calves, but again it was remarked that some of the choicest entries were not able to be at the sale owing to transit difficulties. Despite this, the week ending the 15th of December, the Limerick port was very busy. There were 9 vessels in the port discharging or taking in cargo. Ships were in from Philadelphia and Argentina, and £50,000 worth of bacon and butter was leaving the port for Liverpool each week. The transit issue was a major cause of consternation in the city and in the newspapers. The issue was the haphazard train service that often didn't run at all. The Leader of Monday the 8th of November reported that armed policemen had boarded a 3 p.m. train on Limerick on the Saturday, and the driver had refused to leave with them on board. This was an action that was repeated often over the coming weeks. It resulted in passengers travelling to Limerick Junction to get the train from there. On the 10th of November, Limerick Chamber of Commerce suggested that the Postmaster General introduced a motor mail service between Limerick and Limerick Junction to get around the continual stoppage of the train. This idea was struck down by the Secretary of the GPO in Dublin. On the 20th of November, there was no mail service to the city. By the 6th of December, the motor service on Thomas Street saw a gap in the market and was offering a regular motor service from Limerick to Limerick Junction twice a day, so people could get the train to Cork or Dublin. The train issue was finally resolved on the 29th of December. Elsewhere in the city, on the 3rd of November, brought news in all 3 publications of a baby girl about 10 months old that was abandoned in St. Michael's Church. She had with her a bottle of milk. The baby was taken to Limerick Union Hospital. That same day, another child, 10-year-old Margaret Hayes from Bank Place, was knocked down by a military lorry as she crossed William Street at about 5 o'clock that evening. She was treated at Barrington's hospitals for injuries to her leg and stomach. The Leader of the 10th of November tells of the death of Erie O'Brien, the older brother of the novelist Kate O'Brien, who died while he was participating in a steeplechase in India. There was a break-in reported in the Limerick Leader on the 2nd of December at the Model Dairy Company on Patrick Street. A few nights earlier, the front door had been forced during a curfew. Cheese, fruit, sweets and other goods were taken, as well as 15 shillings worth of silver and copper. It wasn't all doom and gloom. On the 4th of November, a fancy dress dance took place in Thomond Hall, the Royal George Hotel. Prizes were given for the best costume. And on the 25th of November, a lantern photographic exhibition showing slides from the Protestant Young Men's Association Photographic Club was held in their clubhouse on O'Connell Street. The Limerick races were due to take place as normal at Green Park on the 11th of November, but sometime after 2 a.m. a fire broke out in one of the stands. It was decided that the fire was accidental. Although the fire destroyed one of the stands, it did not stop the races from taking place. There were some unusual notices in the press. On the 23rd of November in the Leader, there was a notice. Found on Hearthstone Street last week, a pair of lampshades. Owner can have the same by giving description and paying cost of advertisements at 17 Upper Cecil Street. People did have to continue shopping, and on November 8th, a wonderful advert appears in the Leader. It goes, "Curfew or no curfew, we repair boots in 6 hours. A. Lycett, 13 Allen Street." The Limerick Chronicle of the 20th of November has an advert for wraps, hats, blouses and lingerie are constantly arriving at 14 Bedford Row. Fortunately, these goods do not remain long on the premises, as the quality is superb. In the want ads of the Munster News on the 8th of December, there was the following. Unclaimed at Limerick, one beast. Owner can have the same by giving full particulars and paying expenses incurred. Apply Goods Department, Great Southern and Western Railway, Limerick. There was no indication of what kind of a beast it was, and there was no follow-up report as to whether the beast's owner was found. Finally, at least one man, Gerard Hassett of 9 Boherboy Road, had a very Merry Christmas, as on the 18th of December, the Limerick Leader announced that he was the winner of a ham. His name had been drawn out of a raffle by Mayor Michael O'Callaghan, who was later killed as one of the 2 murdered mayors of Limerick. The raffle was in aid of St. Munchin's Church Building Fund, and the church was completed in 1922. Thank you.
Moríomh Charja agus míle maithagibh as 8 mhór Colúidear. Is mise Dr. Pádraig Óg Ó Ruairc. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for tuning in today. I am Dr. Pádraig Óg Ó Ruairc, and before I begin, I would like to thank Dr. Matthew Potter and Limerick County Council for their invitation to speak to you. So the title of this paper is Identifiers in Limerick During the War of Independence, 1919 to 1921. So the struggle to gather intelligence information between the British Army, the Royal Irish Constabulary and the IRA was undoubtedly one of the most important military aspects of the Irish War of Independence. And this paper will examine briefly the role of identifiers, and that was a particular type of British intelligence agent. It will examine their role during the War of Independence before concentrating on the execution by the IRA of 2 Limerick men alleged to have been British identifiers. So for the British forces, the best way to defeat the Republican insurgency was to acquire accurate intelligence information about the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, their personnel, their supply of arms and operations. And prior to the 1916 Rising, the British government had relied on the Royal Irish Constabulary, or RIC, Britain's colonial police force in Ireland, to gather intelligence information. However, the widespread closure of RIC barracks following IRA attacks, the success of Sinn Féin's police boycott, and the consequent mass resignation of Irish-born RIC constables meant that from 1919 onwards, the British forces became increasingly dependent upon civilians to provide information. And civilians who provided intelligence information to the British Crown forces were dubbed spies and informers by the IRA. Now, during the War of Independence, the Republicans inflicted a variety of punishments on those suspected of being British spies. Some received threatening notices, others suffered economic boycott, had their property destroyed, or were forced into exile. In the most extreme cases, the IRA captured and killed civilians that they alleged were spies. As a guerrilla army relying on secrecy and mobility, the IRA could rarely afford to take alleged spies prisoner for extended periods. The Chief of IRA Intelligence in Cork, Florrie O'Donoghue, commented on the dilemma this posed. Quote, "The absence of any facilities for detention of prisoners made it impossible to deal with the doubtful cases. In practice, there was no alternative between execution and complete immunity." End quote. So given the damage that an active spy could inflict in terms of the capture and execution of IRA volunteers, the killing of suspected British intelligence agents was a necessary military action from the Republican perspective. At this remove, it is impossible to say how many of those executed by the IRA as alleged spies had actually given intelligence information to the British. This is primarily because the British Home Office has refused, in spite of a legal challenge as recently as 2015, to release any historic files related to the identity of British intelligence agents active in Ireland from the late 1800s onwards. This information was refused on the grounds that revealing the identities of British agents over a century ago could still pose a threat to Britain's national security today. What we can say with certainty is that at least 196 civilians accused of spying were killed by the IRA during the War of Independence, and further detail on this can be found in my case study of the subject, which was included in the Atlas of the Irish Revolution. The identity of most of those who were executed can be found in my book, Truce, Murder, Myth, and the Last Days of the Irish War of Independence. The majority of civilians who assisted the British Crown forces gave their information in person to RIC constables or British Army officers whom they knew. Typically, these agents, dubbed informers by the IRA, remained hidden in the background, where they were less likely to come to the IRA's attention. The topic of this paper focuses on the minority of civilians who gave information, motivated either by zealous loyalty to the British Crown or financial incentives, but who were willing not just to give information, but also to guide the British Crown forces in their search patrols to the houses of their Republican opponents and point them out for arrest, internment, torture, and summary execution. These agents were dubbed Identifiers by the RIC constables and British soldiers they assisted. At least 10 of the 196 civilians who were executed by the IRA for spying can be classed as identifiers. In County Limerick, at least 7 civilians accused by the IRA of being British spies were executed during the War of Independence, and 2 identifiers from Limerick were shot, one of them being abducted and executed after the truce. Sir Ormond Winter, who was Chief of British Intelligence in Ireland during the War of Independence, recorded the importance of identifiers in combating the IRA. Quote, "The recruitment of agents was a matter of the greatest difficulty. Englishmen could be found who volunteered for the Secret Service, but Englishmen operating in Ireland were at a serious disadvantage. Irishmen could be found in England, but the majority of these had lived outside of Ireland for some time and had few facilities for gaining inside knowledge. The intelligence service was, therefore, bereft of the aid of those who knew the leading rebels by sight. Closely allied to the question of intelligence was the identification of prisoners. The agents obtained through the local police or the RIC were generally the result of local knowledge and were people who they had been acquainted with in former days, and from them many excellent results were produced." End quote. As the War of Independence intensified, the task of gathering local intelligence information and identifying IRA suspects fell increasingly on the British Army rather than the police. One British Army officer who bemoaned the loss of RIC intelligence gathering noted the usefulness of civilian identifiers and the dangers they faced. Quote, "In the most disturbed districts, the old police, the RIC, who knew the local inhabitants, had often been drafted to other districts for fear of assassination. And the new men, the black and tans and the auxiliaries, were confined to their barracks except when moving around in fairly large patrols. Consequently, these latter never got to know the inhabitants well, and were often quite unable to identify them. Consequently, a considerable number of the officers of the IRA and other men on the run were allowed to go free for lack of identification. As the political situation grew worse, the responsibility for deciding which men should be retained gradually shifted more and more from the police to the military. In regard to the identification of civilians collected, it was found essential that the police or other identifiers should not be seen. Otherwise, if recognised as identifiers, they became marked men and liable later to assassination. At the time, the British acknowledged in the press that civilian identifiers assisted them on raids and searches. For example, the Irish Independent reported that the operation to arrest Joseph Curran, a Sinn Féin member of Dublin County Council, was led by a civilian identifier. At his court-martial, Curran complained of a suspicious figure who behaved aggressively and who was the leader of the search party. Curran described this person as, quote, "having 2 revolvers and a cap pulled down over his eyes as a disguise. He went around like a desperado, terrorising women and children," end quote. When Curran raised questions about the identity of this individual, the Worcester Regiment denied that the individual concerned was a British soldier and insisted that their troops had been led by a civilian guide dressed as a British officer. 7 alleged British spies were executed by the IRA in County Limerick. 2 identifiers from County Limerick were executed, one by the Limerick IRA during the War of Independence and the second after the truce in October 1921 by the Cork IRA. The first alleged identifier from Limerick to be executed by the IRA was Michael O'Mara, a Catholic school teacher who had served in the British Army during the First World War. O'Mara was abducted and executed by the IRA in December of 1920. IRA veteran Daniel O'Shaughnessy claimed that O'Mara's alcoholism had led to his volunteering as an identifier and ultimately to his downfall. Quote, "He would sell his soul for drink and consequently became the companion of the soldier and the tans. As far as information went, he had none. But he went out with the Crown forces into the country at night dressed in an RIC overcoat. He was with them on raids on several farmers' houses, and this seemed to have sealed his doom. His execution was carried out and his body was found at Kiltankin near Kilbeheny on Christmas Eve, laid out on a field with a placard "Shot as a spy" on his breast. The body was never claimed and the Ballyporeen police came and took the body away and buried it in Bully's Acre." End quote. More detailed information is available in relation to Thomas "Tommy" Hanley, who was a Catholic ex-soldier from Newcastle West, County Limerick, and who began a criminal career as an armed robber after returning to civilian life and before becoming an identifier for K Company of the RIC Auxiliary Division. Thomas Hanley was born on the 29th of November 1920. He had 3 older brothers and was the youngest child of Michael Hanley, a general labourer, and his wife Ellen, who lived in the urban working class community of Maiden Street, Gortboy, Newcastle West. After leaving school, Hanley found work as a stock taker, checking freight shipments at the Newcastle West railway station. Like many other young Limerick men from urban working class backgrounds, Hanley volunteered to join the Royal Munster Fusiliers Regiment of the British Army in 1915 and fought on the Western Front for the remaining 3 years of the First World War. Hanley first came to the attention of the IRA after he was demobilised from the British Army. He returned to his hometown and, together with a cadre of other unemployed ex-soldiers in the town, he embarked on a criminal career as a means of earning a living. In the month of January 1920, ex-soldiers in Newcastle West, including Hanley, were suspected of being involved in a spate of armed robberies in the locality, including the robbery of a mailbag containing cash and cheques from a postman at Cracklow, the hold-up of a mail van near Askeaton, the mugging of a cinema owner, and the attempted robbery of a bank in Newcastle West. The activities of Hanley's criminal gang of ex-British Army soldiers intensified to the point that the Limerick Ex-Servicemen's Association placed a notice in the local press condemning and distancing themselves, quote, from the low acts committed recently by some ex-soldiers, end quote. The reluctance of the RAC garrison in Newcastle West to investigate former British soldiers who were engaged in criminality led to the formation of a local vigilante group determined to put a stop to the ex-soldiers' robberies. Local business owners, trade unionists from the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, Irish language activists from Conor na Gaeilge, members of the Gaelic Athletic Association and local IRA volunteers banded together to form a Vigilance Committee. On the 15th of January 1920, members of the Vigilance Committee, who were on patrol in Newcastle West, were attacked and assaulted by the gang of ex-soldiers. In response, the local IRA unit sent for reinforcements, who responded by shooting Timothy O'Sullivan, a member of the criminal gang. The ex-soldiers retreated to the town's RIC barracks, where they sought refuge. The IRA and other members of the Vigilance Committee pursued them and, angered at their escape, took out their frustrations on the building itself, smashing several windows whilst the occupants cowered inside. The sequel to this episode occurred on the 27th of January when the RIC raided the homes of several members of the Vigilance Committee, who they charged with, quote, disturbing the public peace in a manner likely to cause a riot, end quote. 9 local men were held prisoner on these charges in Limerick Prison until the 10th of February, when they were taken to the courthouse in Adare for trial. As per IRA policy at the time, all 9 defendants refused to recognise the legitimacy of the British court. The case for the prosecution relied solely on the statements made to the RIC by 2 ex-soldiers from Newcastle West, Thomas Cronin and Thomas Hanley. However, at the last minute, both Cronin and Hanley rescinded their evidence and the case collapsed, and the 9 members of the Vigilance Committee who had been charged were released. In September of 1920, K Company of the Auxiliary Division of the Royal Irish Constabulary commandeered Devon Castle, the Duke of Devonshire's Newcastle West residence, which dominated the town square. Thomas Hanley apparently still bore a grudge against the local IRA and saw this as an opportunity to take revenge. Hanley quickly became known to local IRA officers, including Garrett McAuliffe, who recalled that, quote, Hanley, an ex-British Army man, joined the Auxies on their patrols and went round with them in lorries, end quote. In November 1920, Hanley, realising that his life was now in danger, left his family home and sought protection by living with the RIC auxiliaries at their barracks in Devon Castle. In January of 1921, Hanley formalised this arrangement by enlisting as a temporary cadet in the RIC Auxiliary Division. McAuliffe claimed that after enlisting in the RIC, Hanley, quote, went around the town in civvies, end quote, presumably as a means of gathering intelligence information. Thomas Cronin, the ex-soldier who had been involved with Hanley in giving evidence against the Vigilance Committee, followed Hanley by enlisting in the RIC Auxiliary Division, as did James O'Dwyer, another ex-soldier from Newcastle West, who had also been a member of Hanley's criminal gang. Another local ex-soldier, John Jordan, a neighbour of Hanley's from Maiden Street, also applied to join the RIC after the IRA accused him of being a spy. A fifth ex-soldier from Hanley's gang, Thomas Riley, was reported to IRA intelligence after he was spotted travelling in a car with members of the Black and Tans. In February of 1921, Hanley was redeployed to an RIC outpost in Croom, presumably for his own protection. Though Hanley disappeared from Newcastle West, he had not been forgotten, and on the 22nd of June 1921, two local IRA volunteers, Owen McAuliffe and Tady Collins, got a tip-off that Hanley had returned to the town to visit a friend, James Coffey, who lived on the Knock-On Road. At 10 p.m. that evening, the two Republicans approached the home of Hanley's friend, James Coffey, in stockinged feet with their revolvers drawn. They burst in and found Hanley seated at the fireside, and the two IRA volunteers immediately opened fire on him. Despite being wounded by the initial burst of fire, Hanley managed to reach the rear door of the building and, still under fire, managed to enter the back garden and escaped along a laneway. Knowing that the sound of their gunfire would draw British soldiers from the Warwickshire Regiment who were stationed nearby, McAuliffe and Collins also fled the scene. Hanley was hit by 5 .45 revolver bullets, but British soldiers arrived at the scene within minutes and, recognising Hanley, saved his life by immediately transferring him to the military hospital in Limerick for life-saving surgery. The failed assassination had the desired effect, according to IRA volunteer Mossy Hartnett. Quote, "This surprise raid kept this man Hanley from having any further association with the Tans and British soldiers in Newcastle West. Spies beware was a warning that was now heeded." End quote. The IRA were determined, however, to kill Hanley, and Garrett McAuliffe recalled, quote, "He was taken into the military hospital in Limerick and we kept an eye on him. After the truce, he went missing." End quote. For 6 weeks after the IRA's failed assassination attempt, Hanley's life hung in the balance, but he recovered enough after the truce to apply to the British government's Irish Compensation Commission for financial compensation. On the application, Hanley listed his profession as ex-constable, and he sought £5,000 for his injuries. On the 10th of October 1921, Hanley received news that he was to be awarded £550 in compensation. Hanley's brother John, who lived in New York, had bought him a transatlantic ferry ticket to come and join him in America. Hanley was apparently waiting to collect his compensation payment before leaving for New York, but he did not live long enough to do either. Michael Hanley stated that his son Thomas, quote, "disappeared quite suddenly and unexpectedly, without informing his parents of his intended departure, without bidding them goodbye, and that he has never been heard or seen of since." End quote. An inquiry to the British Colonial Office revealed that Hanley had not collected the compensation payment which had been issued to him. The Irish Compensation Commission's register had a note scribbled in pencil in the margin reading, quote, "applicant missing." Furthermore, the American consul in Ireland confirmed that the United States government had no record of Thomas Hanley ever having travelled to America. In November 1929, Michael Hanley made a successful application at the High Court in Dublin, seeking to have his son Thomas Hanley presumed dead, and stated in a supporting affidavit, quote, that he had heard rumours that his son had been killed in the county of Cork towards the end of 1921. End quote. The rumours were correct. Thomas Hanley had been abducted by the IRA on the 17th of October 1920 and was executed for spying and secretly buried in an unmarked grave near the town of McCoole, County Cork. The RIC County Inspector for Limerick, John M. Regan, cited Hanley's shooting and his status as a veteran of the First World War as proof of an alleged IRA campaign to murder local ex-soldiers. However, Regan's report neglected to mention Hanley's personal vendetta against the IRA, nor did it mention Hanley's work as an intelligence agent and his previous membership of the Royal Irish Constabulary Auxiliary Division as likely motivating factors in the attempted assassination. The allegation that the IRA nationally used the intelligence war as a pretext to murder ex-soldiers has been repeated by a number of modern academics. However, Dr. Paul Taylor's authoritative research on ex-British soldiers in Ireland has debunked this claim, showing that the situation was far more complex and nuanced, with thousands of ex-soldiers having served in the IRA during the conflict, often in positions of command. Claims of Republican prejudice against ex-soldiers have also been undermined by Dr. John O'Callaghan, whose study on Limerick found that ex-soldiers in the county were more likely to be killed by British Crown forces than by the IRA. So to conclude, the phenomenon of identifiers who assisted the British military in intelligence work has hitherto been a neglected field of research, as have other aspects of the War of Independence related to the role of civilians working on behalf of the British forces. These include the role of loyalist paramilitaries, such as the UVF, who had units in counties such as Longford, Meath, Westmeath and Donegal. Women police searchers in the Royal Irish Constabulary are another very interesting phenomenon that has so far been under-researched. The use of stool pigeons to gather intelligence from IRA prisoners and the recruitment of civilian informers who joined the British Crown forces in the later stages of the conflict and their alleged involvement in assassinations and reprisal killings also require further study. So Sinead and Ishagriv a Míle maith agaibh. Thank you very much for for tuning in, and again thank you to Dr. Matthew Potter and Limerick County Council for this invitation to speak.
Hello everyone, my name is Dr. Brian Hughes and I'm a lecturer in the Department of History at Mary Immaculate College. Before I begin today's talk, I'd like to thank Limerick Museum and Dr. Matthew Potter for the invitation to be part of this symposium on Limerick in 1920. I'd also like to thank William O'Neill for his help in facilitating me to deliver this lecture online, which is unfortunately a product of the times that we're in, but does mean that we can have an event like this at all. So I'm very grateful for that. The paper I'm going to deliver today essentially takes the case of one shooting in Limerick in 1920 and uses it as a starting point to discuss a broader issue. And this is an issue, the shooting of the shooting of members of the IRA by members of the IRA, that is noteworthy, not so much for how often it happens, but actually for how rarely it happens. And it's also noteworthy for the issues that arise in the evidence that survives, the fact that these are killings that tend to be clouded by misinformation and rumour, and they're rarely very clear cut. And James Dalton's killing is a very good example of that. It's unique in some ways, but does speak to this broader issue in some other ways that I'll outline as I go. Over the course of 1920 and into 1921, people reading their daily national or weekly local newspapers in Limerick and beyond would have become increasingly familiar with accounts of bodies found filled with bullets on roads, ditches or down lanes, marked with a note reading something like "Spies and informers beware IRA," or "Tried, convicted and executed by the IRA." According to Ewan O'Halpin and Daithí Corrán's figures, the IRA killed 277 alleged civilian spies and informers between 1919 and 1921, and perhaps more, as new figures may be published in their much anticipated book, which is due out later in the year. Most of these were in 1920 or in the first half of 1921. And these shootings have drawn significant attention from historians, or this type of shooting at least, from historians of the Irish Revolution, with plenty of ink devoted to uncovering the motivations for individual killings or discerning broader patterns like the targeting of Protestants or ex-servicemen, for example. In that context, the shooting of James Dalton on Clare Street in Limerick City on the 15th of May 1920 may have been deemed shocking but unsurprising at first glance. While on his way home from work as a clerk in the electrical department of the corporation on Frederick Street, apparently via a pit stop in a local pub, Dalton was met by a group of armed men several hundred yards from his home and shot to death in front of his young daughter. The coroner found that death was the result of shock and hemorrhage, 6 bullet wounds by a person or persons unknown. But James Dalton was not a civilian alleged of being a spy. He was rather a member of the City IRA's 1st Battalion. Dalton had been seen visiting RIC intelligence officers in early 1920 and accused of being a spy, but had sought to clear his name. And remarkably, a Dáil inquiry was held, and it found that there was no guilty or dishonest motive on his part, and that the suspicions were unfounded. And Dalton's brother even went as far as outlining this proof of his innocence in a Crown Court of Inquiry. But Dalton had been shot anyway, said to have been the result of personal jealousy and animosity between rival factions in the City IRA. The identity of the assassins and their exact motives remains unknown, but the shooting of James Dalton appears to have been one of a handful of cases of the IRA killing one of its own. As I'll argue in the remainder of this paper, even if not especially common, this is still an aspect of the War of Independence in 1920 that might tell us something important about the nature of that war. And as I say, it's not because of how common it was, but rather because of how rare it was and the types of cases that we do know about. Senior figures in the Crown Forces liked to claim that the IRA was willing and able to shoot its own without scruple. In May 1921, for instance, Dublin Castle released a letter supposedly written by a British soldier stationed in Ireland, stating that IRA flying columns were held together mostly by fear and threat. If they desert, they are shot by their own comrades, the letter claimed, while if they're captured, they are shot for murder. Consequently, they've no alternative but to carry on with their policy of terrorism and crime. Sir Neville Macready, appointed General Officer commanding the IRA, or commanding the army, in Ireland in 1920, repeated that idea in his 1924 memoir, Annals of an Active Life, the second volume of that memoir, where he wrote that the rebel rank and file were acting under coercion rather than of their own free will, from a wholesome fear of the penalties to which they were exposed. Macready also asserted that the Lord Mayor of Cork, Tomás McCurtain, killed in March 1920, was, as he put it, murdered by extremists of the IRA without instruction from headquarters, as an example of the fate that awaited those who were not wholehearted towards a policy of indiscriminate murder. Macready further declared that former and current Lords Mayor of Limerick, Michael O'Callaghan and George Clancy, killed in March 1921, had been involved in preventing outrages in the city, and that Clancy had been taken to task for his lack of enterprise as an IRA commander. Judging from the methods of the rebels, he wrote, the supposition that these two men were murdered by their compatriots as a warning to others who might be inclined to dissent from the policy of extremism is by no means extravagant. Ormond Winter, appointed Deputy Chief of Police and Head of the Special Service in Ireland in April 1920, similarly claimed in 1955 that volunteers under the slightest suspicion were executed without compunction. and that McCurtain was killed as an example to the waverers. The police were immediately blamed in the widely publicised inquest verdict on McCurtain's death, and this has generally been accepted as the case by historians. By contrast, it was the military court of inquiry into the deaths of O'Callaghan and Clancy that had first suggested that they were victims of extremist Republicans who disapproved of their attempts to limit violent action. But as John O'Callaghan has argued in his work on Limerick during the War of Independence, there's no evidence to suggest that the mayors were killed by Republicans. It's not clear if Macready or Winter therefore actually believed that the IRA was capable of killing its own en masse. If this was a way of explaining away the conduct of their own forces, or if it was a way of convincing their readers or themselves that this was the sort of brutal and ruthless enemy that they'd been up against. Regardless, it was at best an exaggeration, and as I've said, known cases of Republicans shooting other Republicans are very rare. Some prominent IRA leaders had seen value in the execution of colleagues who had wavered or betrayed the organisation, and the impact of the selective use of the death penalty as a tool for discipline. In December 1920, for instance, Seamus Robinson, as commander of the 3rd Tipperary Brigade, wrote to IRA Chief of Staff Richard Mulcahy to blame desertions and neglect of duty and downright cowardice for the death of a Tipperary battalion commandant. Robinson also suggested that it was time to make the terror behind greater than the terror in front by shooting all really bad cases. This may seem too drastic for ordinary times, he wrote, but now that something of a crisis is on us, we require to show sternness. Mulcahy's reply, however, shows little evidence of a desire to execute without compunction in the way that Macready, Winter, or even Robinson's own letter might have suggested. Mulcahy instructed that where found guilty, deserters should first be put on a definite list for general public knowledge and for future use, but also that all recommendations for the death penalty were to be referred to headquarters for approval. Though it didn't arrive until April 1921, GHQ's, or General Headquarters General Order Number 17, stated that the death penalty could be carried out on an IRA volunteer in cases of knowingly conveying information to the enemy, disclosing to unauthorised persons particulars of plans of operations, the treacherous surrender to the enemy or destruction of arms or war material, or grave insubordination on active operation duty, involving danger to others and to the success of the operation. And these are all direct quotes describing the offences. But it was never to be inflicted without the written consent of GHQ. Now, this was an order that came too late for James Dalton, though given the nature of the shooting and the fact that his shooters, if they were members of the IRA, which they appear to have been, ignored the Dáil inquiry claiming his innocence. This all suggests that, even if General Order Number 17 had existed in 1920, that it would have been ignored by those who shot James Dalton anyway. Any punishment had to be carried out at a local level by local men ultimately, and there was very often an understandable reluctance to do so. Something else that makes Dalton's case especially noteworthy, and again suggests that it probably happened outside of the normal dynamics of internal IRA discipline. In March 1920, Pádraig Larmer, a member of the Rockcorry IRA company in Monaghan, was executed by his comrades for divulging names while under arrest and interrogation. James Sullivan and John McGahey had argued against the sentence, and decades later McGahey remained adamant that the execution was much too drastic. The attempts to save Larmer and the retrospective regret, no more so than the rarity of such cases in the first instance, make it clear that shooting a volunteer was uncomfortable for those involved and widely undesirable. In a war that was as often characterised by the absence of extreme violence as by its presence, particularly when compared to contemporary conflicts elsewhere in Europe and particularly Eastern Europe in the interwar years, such reticence is perhaps unsurprising. And I think that's one important aspect of the War of Independence that this demonstrates, that, you know, in many respects, the violence of 1920 was quite restrained. It's no consequence to its victims in 1920 in Ireland, but compared to what could have happened and what did happen elsewhere, 1920 maybe isn't quite so violent in that context. It was, after all, one thing to justify shooting a uniformed servant of the Crown or a civilian informer, but it was something entirely different to kill one of your own. Close personal and often familial bonds existed within local IRA units, and men naturally developed a sense of loyalty towards each other, a loyalty that could supersede their loyalty to army hierarchy. It was, for example, only what historian Hughes described as the strong bonds of friendship that evolved in the columns that prevented the court-martial of men who fled the scene of 3 ambushes in Mayo, an offence that could have carried the death penalty. Equally, personal loyalty and commitment made coercion and punishment unnecessary among core groups of active gunmen. Dave Fitzpatrick observed how the drift into flying columns in 1920 also produced tighter, more disciplined and more effective fighting groups. The discipline and loyalty of the columns may not always have been directed towards GHQ, but it could still negate the need for punishment. Now, somewhat ironically, it's probably those local bonds and clashes amongst groups that led to Dalton's killing, which again does make it stand out a little bit. And Dalton's case was unique in some other respects. His was the only known case where a Dáil pardon was issued before a shooting, for instance. Dalton was also well known in Limerick in sporting and Republican circles, and his death was very firmly in the public domain. But the understanding of the motivation for his shooting, both then and now, is characterised as much by rumour, accusation and denial as by fact. Various explanations were offered at the time and since for Dalton's shooting and for his visits to RIC intelligence officers. He's been accused of being a spy and of being a double agent mistaken for being a spy. He's been described as the victim of a dispute between the 1st and 2nd battalions of the Limerick City IRA, which seems the most likely explanation. It appears to be the explanation, and as a heavy drinker whose thirsty soul got him into trouble. And that thirsty soul was a phrase used by Kevin O'Sheil and not by me. He was at the same time a prominent sportsman in the city, as I've said, a splendid specimen of a man, as O'Sheil described him, and one of the 1st Battalion Limerick men who'd mobilised in 1916. There are accounts that say he was shot by the IRA, another by the IRB, while in official records it remains person or persons unknown. And in that respect, Dalton's case mirrors the vague or contradictory accounts that often surround other inter-IRA shootings. Gerard Murphy, in his book The Year of Disappearances, has noted how spies from within the IRA's own ranks tended to disappear without trace, and that anecdotal evidence suggests that there were more than he could account for in Cork alone. Such anecdotes are problematic on their own, as are any related assumptions about members of the IRA executed or disappeared without evidence. Killing in this way relinquished the wider coercive value that was identified as one important feature of the use of the death penalty internally, though there was also a power to disconcerting local rumours and speculation. So if someone disappeared, that could be as powerful as their body being found in a ditch. But there's also the potential that it loses some of that public and immediate impact as well. It may have been considered expedient in some circumstances to kill an internal spy secretly. Civilians were also shot and buried or hidden or disappeared in some recorded cases, though this is difficult to prove. But even in a very public case like James Dalton's, accounts are, as I've said, subject to rumour and misinformation. So even it being a public killing doesn't necessarily clear it up. One case from County Cork is illustrative here. In his 1974 book Execution, Sean O'Callaghan described on the information of Cork IRA veteran Frank Bustede the capture of an IRA man nicknamed Din Din, a Kerryman. Din Din's confession under the promise of a free passage and £50, and his execution. In fact, several variants of the Din Din story exist. In The IRA and Its Enemies, published in 1998, Canadian historian Peter Hart gave a detailed account of the killing of RIC Sergeant James O'Donoghue in November 1920 and the reprisal killings by police that followed. Based on Busteed's description and an interview with Elizabeth O'Connor given in 1969 and held in private papers, Hart described how suspicion for a police tip-off about O'Donoghue's killers fell on Dennis Din Din O'Riordan, followed by his execution in April 1921. A similar story was narrated by FINA member George Hurley, who told the Bureau of Military History, or BMH, that an IRA man suspected of giving information as to who shot Sergeant O'Donoghue was later apprehended and executed by the IRA. In 1957, Leo Buckley left a statement with the BMH describing the shooting of Dennis Donovan, nicknamed Din Din, as a spy on brigade instructions for giving information to the RIC on the shooting of O'Donoghue. This Donovan at least, was supposedly close to members of the local IRA, but is not described as a member by Buckley. In April 1921, the RIC had reported that Dennis Donovan was a Sinn Féiner, their general term for Republican in this period, sort of blanket term they used, who had been shot for taking part in a robbery without authority, while the military inquiry in lieu of inquest suggested that he was the victim of those who'd been involved in the robbery. These are all seemingly the same man, and if this is difficult to follow, that's very much the salient point here. Hart, it seems, took the name O'Riordan from Elizabeth O'Connor's account, and she may have been mistaken, and he suggested that as there was no other record of the shooting of a Dennis O'Riordan, he was alone in the city and simply disappeared. Dennis Donovan, however, did not disappear. He was shot and killed by the IRA in April 1921. If his membership of the organisation and his motivations for his killing are contested, his death is not. There may or may not have ever been a Dennis O'Riordan. Another anonymous IRA man in O'Callaghan's book, who told Din Din there was easy money to be earned in informing and was also shot by O'Callaghan's account, seems to have vanished from the record, if he ever existed at all. So again, it's the layers of mystery and the confusion here and the contradictory accounts and the different details that are most revealing here, rather than the facts, whatever they may have been. Memoirs and witness statements describing these events must be treated with some caution, written or collected decades after the events they describe. Sources like the BMH are subject to all the failings as well as the possibilities of any oral or written testimony, including ailing memory, subjectivity, and appeals to posterity. In Tipperary, for instance, newly married John Buckley was alleged to have been shot as he had stopped attending night manoeuvres with his IRA company. Contradicting evidence given at the inquest at the time of Buckley's death, Tadhg Crowe maintained that he was labelled a spy by police in civilian clothes, and there was no doubt about his integrity. Now, the police were known to have shot people and tried to pin it on the IRA, but whether it happened in this case or not is unclear. Seamus Robinson, who was so keen to shoot all really bad cases in December 1920, remained revealingly silent on the matter in his own statement to the Bureau. The errors, the silence and the mystery should not be surprising given the obvious discomfort of the subject matter. And again, I think that's important when interpreting James Dalton's death as well. It might also have been, as Gerard Murphy has pointed out, preferable to look outside the organisation for traitors or to direct the blame elsewhere. Sean O'Hegarty, for example, either refused to heed or decided not to believe warnings that information was being passed to Crown forces from within the ranks of the IRA in Cork City. The mistakes could also be painful. Kevin O'Sheil, who knew James Dalton but was only privy to second-hand information about his death, described the killing as a tragic mistake, indeed a crime. The killers themselves remained silent. But at the same time, decades later, Thomas Crawley recognised that in Roscommon we were damned right from the start by having traitors and agents among us, and traitors and agents among us in the area, and we were never really able to get control over this situation or eliminate that danger. His own brigade intelligence officer was found out to be an intelligence agent for the British, who was able to leave the country and was never got, as Crawley put it. Ewan O'Halpin has suggested that there may have been many more volunteers acting as informers in local units across Ireland, yet most seem to have gone undetected, or at least unpunished. In Dalton's case, localised tension seemed to have been the driver for the killing, but local conditions could also serve to mitigate or suppress violence, and regional ties, allegiances and conflicts were often a deciding factor in the extent and nature of discipline and punishment within the IRA, and indeed in terms of violence more generally as well. In Limerick, internal disputes and grievances had a long afterlife. They were, for example, well-known cases of men, there are lots of disputes and rows within the local IRA while the Bureau of Military History statements were being compiled and while military service pensions applications were being compiled as well in the 1930s, 1940s and into the 1950s. And you can read, John O'Callaghan has a good account of some of the issues with the Bureau statements. And if you look up the brigade activity reports for Limerick brigades online, you'll find lots of debate and disagreement amongst members of various units. In one account written while pensions were being adjudicated on, it was claimed that a man applying for an IRA pension had actually refused to cooperate with the Republican forces and was later sentenced to death as an enemy agent, while another resigned from the IRA and surrendered to the enemy to avoid court-martial. Now, regardless of the truth of these accusations, nothing was done to deal with them. So why one alleged traitor might be shot and another left alone seems to have been inherently localised. Individual units drawn from peers in the same community were sometimes guilty of refusing to punish a member of their own group or of ignoring the orders of superiors, particularly when it came to a reduction in rank for a locally elected officer. In the Dunamore Battalion in Cork, for example, the men threatened to leave when their commandant was court-martialled and dismissed. Sean Moylan, commandant in the Cork No. 2 Brigade, requested permission from Mulcahy to deal quietly with local officers proposed for court-martial, as a reduction in rank might have a bad effect on the rank and file, he suggested. He'd previously been forced to back down and reinstate an officer dismissed for failing to obey orders. Similarly, Sean Boylan's repeated calls for the dismissal of a battalion adjutant in Meath who'd refused to bring cartridges to an ambush site went unheeded by the battalion staff. So local personalities are really important in all this. Flogging was a dramatic but seemingly ineffective alternative to execution, though again it was rarely used. It was opposed by GHQ and had actually been banned by the British Army in 1881. Fines might have been a useful if unpopular alternative and a way to raise much needed cash. But while widely applied by the IRA to civilian dissenters, fines were seemingly rarely imposed internally. Mossy Harnet's memoir records a volunteer in Limerick who refused to obey orders being fined £5, but even this paled in comparison to the £50 that Harnet remembered being collected by the same company from a farmer who'd handed his rifle over to Black and Tans. O'Halpin has concluded that in comparison to their search for civilian spies, the IRA remained dilatory in weeding out and punishing spies within their own ranks. Ill discipline, desertion and internal informers were indeed far more common than the small number of known inter-IRA executions would suggest. And indeed, James Dalton's shooting, if indeed it was, as it very much seems to have been, a case of the members of the IRA shooting him, was an example of ill discipline. It was ignoring orders that he had not been guilty of being a spy, and for whatever reason he was shot. It's indiscipline in its own right. But generally speaking, shooting a comrade was undesirable and uncomfortable. Internal discipline and personality clashes remained a challenge both for IRA GHQ and for local leaders bound by community politics. The IRA, it might be suggested, was far more adept at punishing, intimidating and coercing servants of the Crown and civilians than dealing with its own. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you on this historic year of 1920. I'm here in my capacity as a historian in the commemorations unit of the Department of Tourism, Culture, Gaeltacht, Sports and the Media. I'm delighted to be able to give this talk. It's particularly special to me because, of course, Limerick is my hometown, and many of the places that feature in this particular presentation have a resonance for my own life. But we're going to go back in time now, before my own lifetime, and into the story of Limerick in 1920 and the arrival of Salesian sisters, Sister Giovanna Martinoni, Sister Mary Giotto, her sister Luigiano Giotto, who was her sister both in life and in religion, and Sister Kathleen Cairns. When we think about Limerick in 1920, particularly the audience for this particular talk will be very aware of what was happening in Limerick. But I'm just going to take 1 minute to sort of just set the scene on the off chance that somebody would come across this presentation and not be fully aware of what was happening. So in 1920, Ireland was under English rule, and the country would have been dominated by a huge number of organizations fighting for Irish independence. By 1920, there had been a government formed, an underground government formed, and there had been a guerrilla warfare commenced the previous year in order to fight for that independence. Limerick would have been a garrison town, and it was very militarized. There were barracks, New Barracks, Sarsfield Barracks, Strand Barracks, and they all would have had military. And then there was, in 1920, the police force, the Royal Irish Constabulary, was augmented by an auxiliary force of officers and another force that was a general force that was known as the Black and Tans. That was a name that was ascribed to them because they had a mixture between the police uniform and an army uniform, and somebody commented that they looked like the Black and Tans of a County Limerick hunt, in fact, the dogs of County Limerick hunt, and the name stuck. And so it was quite a tense atmosphere. There was permits needed. There was periods like streets that were closed, and it was very tense because of being a guerrilla warfare. There were a lot of raids on people's houses. The military were not sure of who exactly was involved, and so the warfare would spill out from the barracks and onto the streets. And the nearest barracks centrally in the town was William Street, and there was a lot of activity around that particular police barracks. So how did these nuns come to enter into Limerick on this very day? Actually, we're recording on the 23rd of October, which is actually the centenary day. So I think that's particularly important also when we talk about 100 years on. In many ways, for most of my professional life, I seem to have lived in the 1910s and 1920s. And so I'm very familiar with the names and people of this time. But at this moment, Bishop Dennis Hallinan was Bishop of Limerick. You can see him here, and it is Bishop Hallinan who invites the Salesian sisters to Limerick. They were an Italian order that had been established by John Bosco in Turin, and the sisters had been established by Mary Mazzarello. So it was in the main, even then, an Italian order, but it was sending out missionaries across the world to continue with the ethos of the Salesians, which was that Don Bosco had set up his order in order to give instruction to poor boys. At the time, it was the poor boys of Turin, and he set up workshops and kept them occupied and industrious, and to keep them away from, for a life of crime in the main. And Salesians were assisted by what were known as cooperators. So they always worked within the community, and they had a particular focus on young people and improving the lot of younger people. And Bishop Halnan was familiar with Don Bosco. He'd actually met the founder of the order in Italy, and there was some talk that he himself may have joined the Salesian order, but he instead returned home to his own native Limerick, and in time he became the bishop. So he was very keen on this order coming to Ireland. At the moment that he was inviting the Salesian sisters to Ireland, he had possession of a long lease of several decades, I think 70 years actually, of St. Ita's house, which was on Thomas Street, next door to the Gaelic League. And it had what we would have known in growing up as Hala Ida attached to it. And it had always been used by different religious groups, and it had previously been used as a school. But at the moment that the Salesian sisters were arriving, the original intention was that they would set up a domestic economy school, and that they had looked at different locations close to Palace Kenry, where the Salesian priests had just set up the agricultural school in the previous year, in 1919. But St. Ida's house, as I've described here, is a terraced. It was very large, and this is how it was described actually in the correspondence at the time rather than in my words. So it was very large. It had a splendid theatre at the back. It had no land attached to it, but it was a house in one of the principal streets of the town. So they were encouraged to accept this as a house, because it would put them at the centre and the heart of Limerick City. But I suppose the focus of this particular lecture is to sort of illustrate what was happening in what we know as the War of Independence, or more particularly, I suppose, we describe it as the Campaign of Independence, and that the Salesian sisters found themselves not alone in the heart of Limerick, but at the heart of the military struggle that was ongoing. You can see a letter here from Father Sutherland, whose name may be familiar as the name Sutherland because of his very famous grandnephew, Peter Sutherland, who went on to work not only in Europe as a commissioner for Ireland, but in a lot of important companies, and was in all his career a formidable man. But his granduncle Aloysius seems to have had the same ability of negotiation and overcoming problems in order to attain his goal. So at the moment, I'm going to talk a little bit about him in a moment, because he's the man who brought the Salesian Foundation to Ireland. But at the moment that the Salesian sisters were coming, the house that they were going to, so St. Ida's house, was actually run by a committee of ladies. Now, these committee of ladies had resigned in and around this particular period of time. We don't know the circumstances of that resignation, but we do know that that the sisters were taking over not only a confraternity in the parish of St. Michael's, so that would have been a group of younger women who would have attended a weekly religious service. They would have usually been 14 years and up. The confraternities were huge in Limerick. For those of you who are not familiar with Limerick had many churches, many different religious orders, and confraternities were a way of socializing as well as being a religious instruction. So what would happen is that people would go to these confraternities in neighborhood clusters and in family groupings, and so that would be how they would come together and meet. So by the sisters actually having access to a confraternity was really important, because it meant that they had already a willing group of people who would be interested in taking part in their activities. So this is just a piece around the fact that the rent was £30 a year to the sisters, and there was also talk that they would have another house, which was the bishop's preference, Richmond House. But I'm going to talk about Richmond House in a little while, because that was their second convent rather than their first. So they were, there was some objection to the bishop of a new religious order coming into the town, because obviously it meant that it would affect the work of other communities and other communities of sisters and other convents and other convent schools. But because they had the backing of the bishop, they were provided with this footing within in the town at that particular moment. So I've mentioned to you already Father Sutherland here, who's in this picture, along with Fathers Brownrigg, Devine, Gray, and the two Gray brothers. And they were the owners of the house that was purchased in Pallaskenry for the agricultural school. And then there's another member of the community, was Donald Lever, who's also in this image. And these were the first community in Pallaskenry, and that's how this particular image is notated, rather than having describing who's who in the particular picture. So I'm unable to point out the various people, but Father Sutherland is probably the man that's sitting here. So when he talked about about setting up the foundation, how did he manage it? He came from England, where he'd already been highly successful in establishing a boys' school, a middle-class school, which still exists today. I read their prospectus, and it's still a very impressive school for what we would describe, and what was described at the time, as middle-class boys. And so he established that in Farnborough, and he also was very successful in encouraging both men and women to enter the Salesian order. This is an account written of a thesis by William John Dickinson, which is part of the collection of Durham University. And he wrote his thesis on the foundation and development of the Salesians in England, the dynamics of growth. And you can see here in a section from this thesis that he says that the Irish identity found expression among the Salesians in the person and actions of Aloysius Sutherland. He managed to single-handedly, at least, without the approval of anyone else, to commence Salesian work in Ireland. And by 1924, had 2 agricultural schools underway. The thesis focuses a lot on the authority of the structure of the Salesians in England. But you can see when he describes what happens at this moment, as Father Sutherland is trying to get his foundation in his home country, which he's very passionate about. The head of the Salesian order is actually not available. This is at the time of the First World War, and he is actually imprisoned during this period, and so so he ends up having an opportunity to progress his plan, and in order to achieve his objective of the Salesians, both priests and nuns, to come, or priests and sisters, I should say, coming to Limerick. And so here we have some of the material around the political and the politicization of the clergy during this period. And Father Hallinan was very well known for his support of the Sinn Féin movement. And so what we have here is some of the leaflets that are part of the collection of the National Library of Ireland, talking about and quoting Father Hallinan in 1918, when this underground government and the members of the Sinn Féin party were elected overwhelmingly with a mandate now for the people to fight for their own parliament in Ireland and for Irish independence. So this was that he wrote in this letter that was in the newspaper, that was made into a pamphlet, that to send Irish representatives to the British Parliament would be nothing more or less than a silly farce. So we know that in 1918, or some of us know that in 1918, the overwhelming victory of Sinn Féin displaced the Irish Parliamentary Party, which had been taking their seats in Westminster, and then they decided they were going to set up what was known as Dáil Éireann in Dublin. And obviously for a period of time they met openly, but then it became prescribed and they had to go underground. So by the time that the Salesian sisters arrived in October of 1920, it's already an underground government, as I've already described. But Father Hallinan had made very public his objection to British rule in Ireland, and so he also is involved with the political, the new political elite that is established itself in Limerick at this time. It probably will come as no surprise to some of you that the interconnection between ladies' committee, and Mrs. O'Callaghan, who was the wife of the Lord Mayor, the Sinn Féin Lord Mayor, Michael O'Callaghan, who had just taken up the position as Mayor of Limerick County Council, representing this new nationalist organisation. So she was a Kate Murphy. She was actually baptised Kate, not Catherine. She was one of a large family of the Murphys who were involved in nationalism. One of her brothers in Cork would have had an involvement in the 1916 Rising, but I'm concentrating in the main on the women of the family, of which there were many, and the three sisters that came to Limerick. So her sister Moira was married to and was Mrs. Moira O'Donovan. She didn't have family, but she resigned her position in Mary Immaculate Training College, which was a large training college for primary school teachers, as it still is today, as part of the work of Mary I, as we now know it. So she was secretary of the Women's Committee. Her sister Moira was involved also in nationalist activities. And when Moira married in 1909, she encouraged her sister, Kate, who had just completed her training. She had done Celtic studies at university, in the Royal University, and then she'd gone on to take a teacher training diploma in the Cambridge diploma, which she would have done in the Dominicans in St. Mary's in Dublin, and then it qualified for teaching. And she came to Limerick to do teaching methods, which would have been from the various pieces that have remained in Mary Immaculate's archive. You can see that it was like the teaching methods for Montessori and the type of equipment that was used in the classroom, and teaching methods of engagement for teachers with their students, particularly at primary level and preschool. Well, so when Kate O'Callaghan marries Michael O'Callaghan, she actually also gives up her work, and then a third sister, Eilish, who used her name always in Irish, Eilish Nimura, who took over the role, and she remained at the college. So from the earliest years of the secular teaching in the college, the three Murphy sisters really keep that connection with the college right up into the 1940s and 50s, and obviously still are involved in the cultural life of Limerick with their involvement with Féile Limni, which is in a very interesting connection later on with the Salesian sisters. But I'm going back to 1920 and keeping my concentration as best I can on this year of 1920. So her husband was the Lord Mayor, and we know that that when there had been complaints by the religious orders, told the nuns to give them a chance and carry on, and life was made easier by the goodwill of new friends. The Lord Mayor was entitled to a percentage of the coal that came into the port of Limerick, and from the time of their arrival, it was given to the Salesian sisters, as it was always given to some charity. Now, when you read the accounts of the nuns, of course, it's just that it's the Mayor of Limerick, and then, of course, when you look at the dates, you realise it's Michael O'Callaghan is the Mayor. So again, this underscores the connection between the O'Callaghans and the sisters, and later on, Eilish goes on to provide them with the exams papers that are being provided to the Mercy Sisters because they're trying to establish their schools, but that's a little bit outside our time frame. So on they arrive on the 23rd of October, as I've already explained, and then on the 8th of November, just 15 days after their arrival, their night school started. Now, what's interesting to see, and what I wanted to really talk about in this lecture in particular, is the sort of the exciting feeling that one has when one sees new sources. And what was particularly important to me when looking at this was that I realized how much you're guided by the sources that maybe come from the activists themselves. And we've been really particularly looking at that with everything from the Military Bureau pension records and the Military Archives records. We're looking at records being generated by the activists themselves. And so here we have another view of what was going on for the general population. So, but even within the sisters, there's a slight change, and so I'd look at two different sources. So when Kathleen Clarence was recalling that night of the 8th of November, she said it was such a novelty with new nuns. They came in their crowds. So the girls that attended the night school, and of course, as I said, it's a night school, and there were curfews in place. At periods, they were more intense than others. And so at this point, there mustn't have been a curfew in Limerick. I would have just assumed that the curfew was constant, but it must have come and gone during periods of time. And maybe somebody out there would know a little bit more about that and might be able to assist with a clarification in that area. But also on the same date, writing in the Chronicles, which would have been written that day or within that period of time, maybe that week, sort of like the journal of the nuns that was kept and then given to the internal archives, noted that despite our goodwill, it is almost impossible to carry on because of the political disturbance which prevails between England and Ireland. And so now I'm going to talk about the first women that came. And of course, you probably remember that I said that there were 4 women, but unfortunately, we don't have an illustration of Sister Mary Giotto's younger sister, but that's her entry into the Chronicle. So what was really important about the women that arrived at this particular moment is that they're all members of a community who had enlisted in the main in Italy. Italy had gone through a period of persecution of religious, and so these women would have experienced that growing up, and it would have underscored the importance of their religion. Sister Giovanni Martinone, who actually ended her days in America, in New Jersey, seems to have been somebody who was flexible and adaptable and had lived in many places outside Italy. So she was sent over from Italy to Belgium, and then Belgium she ended up then afterwards in the English province. And so her English was particularly good, and you can see that even in the letters that pass before they arrive in Ireland. And so that's one of the reasons that she was selected to attend. And she went to the States after her time in Limerick to bring over young women to the American province. And so she remained in America, and that's where she died in 66 in old age. But she was seen for her skill and her ability to be able to negotiate and to work. In some of the accounts of the students, they said that some of the nuns didn't have good English, but I think that was a way of, that they weren't maybe as confident with native speakers at times, or that it was a way of observing what the girls were doing and maybe not letting on that they actually understood as much as they did. I don't know which it was, but certainly she wouldn't have been able for the high level negotiation that was required had she not had a good level of English. Sister Mary Giotto had also come from Italy to work in England before she came to Ireland. And one of the things that was very important about Mary Giotto was that she had actually worked in a mill when she was a young girl, and she had had the experience of working on the factory floor. And so one of the things that was very important for the Salesian sisters was that they were going to be getting factory girls, the people who had left school at 12, who had a level of literacy and ability, but needed to upskill to a particular level. So what do I mean by that? I mean that the sisters were teaching them domestic economy, which allowed them to go into service. They were teaching them maybe different foods and different methods that were coming from Europe that may have allowed them to maybe get a better position if they had traveled to the States or in a larger house, because they would have been able to do different things. They were also been teaching them basic scrubbing and basic cooking as well. But again, where were the skill set? Where was the thinking? And also for the teaching of embroidery, which was really important in Limerick at this time, when it had so many large department stores, which still up to this period, it's just about changing. They actually had a lot of staff that lived in, and then would have done a lot of the repairs and a lot of the adapting of clothing in that within the store. And then of course there were the sort of the warehouses, and so where you had someone like who was a court dressmaker, and we know that Kathleen Clark was one of those. She has already left Limerick at this particular point, but she had when she was there, she had a court dress makers, and that was copying the fashion plates that were coming from other places. So there was a very vibrant, certainly in the period in the First World War, like Limerick was very wealthy. It starting already to sort of be going down at this particular time. But if you think about the amount of industry that was there were quite a lot of fashionable ladies who would have liked the sort of the finer embroidered clothing that the nuns were teaching their students. And then we also have in the picture here Kathleen Cairns, who was born in Aldershot to an Irish father. He was from Northern Ireland. He was a builder, and when she entered, she expressed a desire to go to Ireland. That she said that it was the land of her family, so she had an interest. But I think she was very brave, in particular because, of course, she would have had an English accent, so she was arriving into a war zone. And while, of course, they were wearing a habit, so there may have been some protection in terms of maybe the community, it was still a situation where there was a lot of hostility. And obviously, Catholics would have been associated very much with the Irish population. So there was no real protection, because there was a lot of killings and shootings that were happening, because gun battles were happening on the streets. There were raids of houses, and the nuns were not immune. Their house was raided. They still had to post up on the door their names, their details, and they were subjected to raids because, of course, they had entered into St. Itas, which was next door to the Gaelic League, and it's next door to the place in which Common Amon had been established. And of course, Kate O'Callaghan would have been involved in that, and Kathleen Clark, whose sisters were still in Limerick, the Daly sisters, would have been members of that. So these are the type of people that are moving around the building and next door and in the community, and were would have come to know the sisters. We are looking now and focusing on the year of 1920. And what's really important about the 1920 is to remember that how intense the warfare was at this particular period of time. It didn't take long before the women who had arrived in the train station on the 23rd of October were actually brought close to the activity. But just for a moment, I just wanted to just paint the scene of where the convent in Thomas Street was at the time. So it faced onto O'Mara's bacon factory. So it was very much in the industrial centre of the city. There were a number of the Georgian houses that did have the likes of, agents for goods. There was a dentist, there was solicitors firms, but most of the people that worked on the street were doing various jobs. So it would have been quite noisy, and it would have been right in the centre. There would have been a lot of animals, going back and forth. It was a hive of activity. But just to focus in again on the warfare at this particular time, they would have been brought up close and personal to the activities when shooting was heard 4 days after they arrived. Shot were fired across the street, and this was at Geary's Hotel, where Michael Scanlon, who was a national school teacher, but he was also a member of the East Limerick IRA Brigade. He had escaped from police custody, which I'm assuming was from William Street, where the police barracks was at the time. And he made his way as far as Geary's Hotel, which was at the junction with Catherine Street and Thomas Street. And he was found there by the members of the police force who were blackened hands, and he was shot several times. Now, according to the plaque that's on Thomas Street, he was shot at that particular point, and that's where he died. But other accounts suggest that he actually died later from his wounds. His funeral was large and was through the streets of Limerick again. And when the coffin was opposite the William Street barracks, again, which indicates that it probably he had been there, the tricolour was ripped from the coffin at that particular point. So all of this would have been being discussed at the time. If the women hadn't been very much involved or knowing the politics of Ireland, they certainly would have got up to speed very, very quickly in the context of this moment where Michael Scanlon was killed. So the school was working, the night school was working, and continuing on, and very soon word went back. I mean, literally within a very short space of time, and they were joined by 3 additional sisters who came across. So there are impressions of Limerick, and the fact that the war was so intense, the fact that this had happened opposite their convent, wasn't necessarily relayed back to England in the way that it stopped the nuns coming. Even so, the next 3 women who came were actually all Irish sisters of Irish birth. Now, we don't know why they weren't in the initial group to come, and this is obviously photographs of them in older age. They were much younger at the period when they came to Limerick. So now in Limerick we had 6 Salesian sisters. So the new arrivals came to the house that originally was selected by the bishop as an ideal location to have the sisters living. But at the time that they originally were coming, the house wasn't vacated yet, and so it was this idea that it was within a walled convent, that there would have been a degree of protection, that would have had an opportunity to grow vegetables and be in a degree self-sufficient. But the house was in very bad disrepair when they arrived. It had stables, and it had a lot of things attached to it, but it was pretty run down. So the three Irish sisters and took Sister Giovanni Martelloni with them, while the others remained in Thomas Street. And what's interesting again is, from what I described earlier on, is that move by the foundation sister Martelloni means that she was again setting up, establishing them, and sort of troubleshooting any difficulties that they may have in moving into this new convent, and the way that she moved up. And so the other sisters remained in Thomas Street, again at the center of the fight. Now, by moving the up to where it was, I'm going to just show you a few images here, and thanks to Paul O'Brien for some of this material has come from his collection on Twitter. So one of the things that was interesting is that they mentioned that they could see the Spillane Tower, and the house Richmond for a period of time had been owned by the Spillane family, which were one of the tobacco and cigarette manufacturers in the town, which people may know of. But I thought was really interesting here that when you see it in terms of the map where it is, just on the edges of the river, that even today, this is taken by Paul O'Brien's drone, it is still very much as it would have been maybe all those years ago. So you can have Richmond House here, and then the description of it is it's very close to where Mary Immaculate is today. So from this bigger account, you can sort of see where Mary Immaculate is, and you can see that at the time that their view, it would have been in the distance, but they still would have had a clear view of this from the house. It had been, the tower had been built in memory of William Spillane. And so here we're back again to the story of the 3 additional sisters. I'm just going to go back for a second just to talk to you a little bit more about them, just before I leave the story. So Margaret Fitzgerald was from Wexford, and she was visiting. She was one of a large family. I think there were 14 children there, and she was the youngest of the family. And she was visiting in Farnborough, where this was the Salesian community, visiting sisters of hers who worked there, and that's how she came to know of the Salesians, the religious order and their ethos and what they were doing in England. And then she joined there. She was very successful in England, and she very quickly got all of her training. So she was trained in music, as well as having a teacher training qualification. So of course that was very valuable in Limerick, because every skill that you had would have been an enticement to setting up a school. And of course, shortly after they arrived, they did actually set up another school outside of the night school, for younger children. And again, they're in competition with all the other schools, but this is really important for them to gain an income, to get money from the Education Board, which was, of course, still being run by the British. So they were being very clever to try and gain an income and keep the two communities going. And so Sister Mary Keane and Sister Mary Rehill were both from, or she would have pronounced her name Kane because she was from Northern Ireland, and she had run a farm up there when her father died, and her vocation was in her late 20s. And I'd love to know what her story is, in that to know why she decided to enter, because she was a woman who was running a property in Northern Ireland at this time when she entered. And then Sister Mary Rehill was somebody who had grown up in County Fermanagh, on an island located, Tarnish Island, located on, if I'm pronouncing that right, in County Fermanagh. So she would have actually had attended school and attended by boat. And again, a really interesting story, I'm sure, about her childhood. So again, as you do anything public, if anyone knows anything about either of these two sisters and their life before they entered the convent, I'm sure that Salesian sisters would be very interested to know about that. Actually, it's interesting to look at this is how I remembered the sisters. They just changed their habits when I was in first class in the 1970s. So this is how I remembered the Salesian sisters when they were in my school all those years ago. But just to return to the story of Limerick in 1920, and I'm conscious that I've probably run over a bit over time. The Limerick in 1920, their arrival was, according to Sister Margaret, the country was still in the throes of guerrilla warfare, and St. Ida's house on Thomas Street had windows bullet holed on more than one occasion. And so again, this is a picture of Sarsfield Bridge, and this is just the idea of the soldier on the bridge and the barbed wire that would have been greeting people, and there was no mistaking that it was a very tense situation, and that there was no sense of when this warfare would end. We always have to remember when we're sort of thinking about history that we know what happened next. So we know in 1921 the truce is signed, but they didn't know that in October and November of 1920. It was considered to be the Winter of Terror, sometimes known as the Year of Terror, because of the total uncertainty of the political situation. And it became more and more brutal. And we know that in December, of course, there was the burning of Cork. There had already been in September the sacking of Balbriggan. And so these events were happening, and Limerick was a town, as I said earlier, which had a huge military presence. So I think what the focus of this talk was really to focus on this year. There is a chapter 2 and there is a chapter 3 in relation to the story, because of course the nuns still remain in Thomas Street and in Richmond House when the Civil War happens. And there's also stories in relation to their time there. But that's not the subject of this talk today. I was very fortunate to be selected as the contributor to the centenary book produced on this story by the Salesian sisters, edited by Sarah O'Rourke, and based on and edited by Noel Costello, but it was based on her work that she had gathered in the 1980s, and the memoir of Kathleen Cairns, the story of Lizzie Nolan, the first student, that gives that very vivid account of what it was like to be a student at that night school and how the sisters came. And so the book Against the Odds is available through the Salesian Sisters community. Sorry, I'm just going to hold it up there to the camera. And it's a very worthwhile document of Limerick's history, both social, political and religious. And I just like to say, to conclude this talk, because it is a centenary, that today marks the leaving of the Salesian sisters from the Fernbank Convent. The house that was taken over, it had been the Cleves house attached to the Cleves complex, which had literally been at its height and zenith in the First World War. and then lost that sort of the market for condensed milk because more and more people, you know, learned how to do the technique, and suddenly the house becomes available, and the sisters cross over the Shannon onto the north side of the city, where they established themselves in Fernbank and in Caherdavan and so many other places within the city, and had 100 years of contribution to the people of Limerick. And just to refer back again to the politicisation and the links and their friends, is that they were very supportive of Féile Limni, which of course had been started by Kate O'Callaghan and her sisters to continue the cultural life and ethos of Irish nationalism that they had, that had come through. So the focus on speaking Irish and performing and plays and all of the things that the Salesian sisters were so wonderful at doing. And I conclude by saying that I not only was taught for them in primary and secondary school, but I also would have attended Joy Club on a Saturday, and I actually staged my first play that I wrote and directed at Joy Club when I was at school. So I credit the Salesian sisters for a lot of the things that I do to this day. Thank you very much indeed for listening, and thank you to Dr. Matthew Potter of Limerick Museum and and William O'Neill, also of the museum, who invited me to speak and contribute to this piece. And thank you also to the commemorations unit for their support of this, and for to my colleagues who work behind the scenes working on the commemoration. Thank you very much indeed.